The Boys Who Challenged Hitler, Chapter 16. First Hours of Freedom. On May 27, 1944, Nud and Jens Peterson were released from Nyborg State Prison. On one of the very last days before he was released, Jens took his written student examination for university admission from his cell. Guards explained to adult inmates that number 30 was attempting something extremely difficult, something that required great concentration. As a gesture of respect, the whole section of the prison remained silent during the morning hours as Jens worked. Even the guards refrained from jingling their keys. He got the highest possible score. A Nazi-controlled newspaper complained in print that Jens Peterson should not have had the opportunity to take the test. His chance, said the writer, proved that it was now possible for a saboteur to be a judge in Denmark. Nud and Jens had each served 2 years and a month. Though they were no longer prisoners 28 and 30, there were huge adjustments ahead for both of them. Nud Peterson. It is difficult to imagine or to describe how long the last days of prison were. The minutes crawled by. Each hour took twice as long as the one before. Finally, the moment came when our names were called, the doors to our cells were pulled open, and we were escorted to the gate where our parents stood to receive us. I think they were shocked by our appearance. My street clothing hung like drapery over my thin frame. My hair was barely long enough to put a comb through. Mother could not hold the tears back. We walked through the city of Nyborg to the railway station and caught a train to Odense. There, Nud Hedeland, Little Nud, our partner in the RAF club, way back at the beginning of our resistance, was waiting with his parents to greet us warmly. They drove us by car, a rare treat in wartime, to a tremendous party in our honor. There were Danish flags on the table and roast duckling on the plates. Best of all were ripe, homegrown garden tomatoes, specimens so rich and abundant that Jens and I, after 2 years of bread and porridge, spent much of our first free night rushing back and forth to a toilet. After toast in our honor, we stepped outside and took a walk in the moonlight with Little Nud. At least here was our chance to find out what had happened to our brothers in the RAF club. Where was our cousin, Hans-Jorgen, and Harold Holm? Had they continued to attack the German war machine? Was everyone still alive? Were they free or had they been captured? It had been nearly 2 years since we had heard from the RAF club. My cousin Hans-Jorgen, who like me was 18 years of age now, had written to us all the way through our jail stint in Aalborg, exchanging coded war bulletins with Jens. But then we lost contact with him at Nyborg. For some reason, he quit writing altogether. His final message had said simply, "We continue." The three of us walked back among the Hedeland family's tomato greenhouses, and Little Nud unloaded what we knew. The RF club had expanded while we were in prison, taking on more classmates from the Odense school. They made many strikes, the most powerful of which happened in Naseby, on the outskirts of Odense. There the Germans had taken over an auto plant and retooled it to make mobile homes for their soldiers on the Eastern Front. The factory was an obvious target for the RAF club. They chose the night of the Hans Christian Andersen Nightingale Festival to attack, on an evening when Odense's entire populace was absorbed in celebrating Denmark's most famous author. Several RAF club boys, one of them Hans-Jorgen, entered the factory from the rooftop and discovered inside a treasure of combustible materials, paint thinner, paint itself, and best of all, gas bottles. What a gift they could make for the Third Reich. They piled up some rags, soaked them with gas, and climbed a ladder they had placed inside back up onto the roof. From the roof, they tossed a match or a lighted rag, then they dropped to the ground and took off running. In a matter of moments, a mighty explosion shook the building. The other party guests were calling for us to go back inside, but this was too important. We would have to travel to Aalborg the next day, and here was our only chance to find out. We ignored the calls and stayed outside to hear more. Nud Hedeland told the Petersons that when members of the RAF club turned 18, some wanted to go to England and enlist with British forces. But it wasn't easy. They would have to flee Denmark to Sweden and then make an underground arrangement to continue to Britain. Though they didn't know it, their fate had already been sealed. One of the RAF club's younger members, naively believing that Danish authorities would help them escape to Sweden, had sent an anonymous letter to Danish police that read, "Orla Mortensen, the name of one of the RAF members, is involved in major sabotage," and he gave Orla's full name and address. Within hours, Orla was in custody and others were on the run. One RAF club member leaped out a window when police rang his doorbell. The boy who'd written the letter was tracked down on his bicycle. Hans-Jorgen was overtaken by a Danish policeman after a foot chase across the field. They were immediately convicted by a German court-martial. A month later, the RAF club boys sat in prison glumly awaiting their fate and shooting suspicious glances at each other. Who had been the rat? Soon these RAF club members, including Hans-Jorgen, were transported to the German-run Western prison in Copenhagen in a special wing reserved for political prisoners, those convicted of having committed acts of resistance. As they started back toward the party, Nud Hedlund confessed that he was deeply worried about Hans Jorgen and the others. It was well known that at Western Prison, serious resistors were shipped to a special place, later called the Memory Park, where they were roped to trees and shot to death. With that in mind, they stepped back inside. Nud Peterson. We sat back down at the table to listen to more speeches and accept more tributes to our courage, but little Nud's report had pulled us back into a reality that, closeted as prisoners, we had not faced in a long time. We were still occupied by an enemy, and we were still at war. After the final speech and the last toast, I was shown by my host to my bedroom. I closed the door and lay down on my bed, head pounding. For the first time in years, I was lying in a room whose windows had no bars. It was like a new life. Perhaps the adults who kindly gathered around us that evening to celebrate our release from prison wanted to give us the impression that there was peace in the world, so that for a short while at least we would taste freedom. But in the minutes before I fell asleep, I could only think about my brothers. Where was Hans Jorgen tonight? Where was Alf? Were they alive? I fell asleep freshly reminded that we were still on the road to an uncertain future and that there was still so much work to do.